Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Pamela Schaff. I want to welcome you today to HEAL's Lunch and Learn event, and just tell you briefly that HEAL's Lunch and Learn series invites scholars from other disciplines, from the arts and humanities and social sciences, to teach us and to help inform our collective understanding of the health of individuals and communities and societies. Today, we're really pleased to partner with Children's Hospital of Los Angeles' Center for Pediatric Bioethics to bring Dr. Nora Jones to the Health Sciences campus. We want to offer a huge thank you to Dr. Sabrina Darrington, who is the director of the Center for Pediatric Bioethics, where she's an attending physician in critical care medicine. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Darrington, who will introduce Dr. Jones and get us started.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schaff, and thank you for coming today and being a part of this really exciting event. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nora Jones. Dr. Jones is an anthropologist by background. She is a bioethicist and an associate professor and the associate director of the Center for Urban Bioethics at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University in Philadelphia. And she's going to be talking to us today about Bastardizing Plato's Cave, Embodiment and Urban Bioethics.
Hi, thank you, yes, for coming and for having an occasion to have a Chipotle burrito. I grew up in Southern California and moved to the East Coast in 1995, and we did not have Trader Joe's nor Chipotle when I first moved there. We do have those now, but it's still always a pleasure to have a California Chipotle. So, yeah, thank you for inviting me. I want to start by explaining my title of Bastardizing Plato's Cave. So starting with the definition of bastardize. I do not mean to declare or prove to be a bastard. That's not what I mean here by the term at all. I'm intrigued by this third definition, to modify, especially by introducing discordant or disparate elements. I think we could make sort of an interesting analogy to different fields of study that maybe have discordant or unfamiliar elements in them. But I really want to engage with this first definition and the unstated value assumptions that are in this definition, that by deviating from some sort of abstract ideal, we are in some way debasing the original concept. So thinking sort of bastardize in a sentence, this first definition, or this first sentence here, it's a shame to see how Hollywood has bastardized the novel. We can all read between the lines in this sentence to, yeah, it's not as good. It's not as classy. It's not as fill in any positive adjective there. Or the second, that the restaurant serves a bastardized version of the classic French dish. Well, there's a value judgment there, and maybe not everyone places the same value on pommes frites, for example. So there's bastardized. What about Plato's Cave? I am an anthropologist by training, technically a visual anthropologist, which means I started my academic career by using museum exhibits and visual images and the visual products that we produce to look through them, to learn more about the culture behind the creators of that. So I use visual analogies to explain sort of academic concepts, and Plato's Cave is one of my favorite. So I apologize to anyone in the room who was a philosophy undergrad or had philosophy training. Indulge me, please, for a second. So in my reading of Plato's Cave, what we have happening here on the left is sort of the ideal, the true form, the thing that the holders of knowledge that are in the light, that can walk around with their own agency and their own power, holding these true forms aloft. And on the bottom left, we have folks who are like chained to their chairs. Their faces are pushed forward. They can't look around. They can't communicate with each other. The idea being that they are somehow unable or deprived from turning around, whipping through their chains, and seeing the truth behind them. As an anthropologist, I'm actually really interested in those folks. I want to know more about the meanings that they're making from the shadows. I care less about the abstract real that is being held aloft behind me. I want to pay attention to the shadows. So my question that I'm engaging with as an anthropologist in medical education, I've been teaching in medical schools for, oh my gosh, maybe 20 years now. So the question that I want to engage with is what happens when we shine a light into those shadows? What happens when we ask questions of the folks in the chains? What happens when we try to figure out how are they communicating with each other? What meanings are they making? What does their world look like? And so that's really my first objective for today, is to put forth the proposition that we need to start paying more attention to the reflexivity, the locations of knowledge. Where does it come from? What are the particular eyes that are viewing the world and making meaning from it? That there's less this what that exists out there that we have to uncover. But what happens when we look at the hows and the whys in a reflexive way? Reflexive is not just navel-gazing, but it's this idea, that this recognition that how I see the world is coming from my set of eyes. And that's hugely important. So that's where we want to sort of start. And so to be reflexive, so that I'm not just another sort of talking head up here telling you about these concepts, I do want to sort of go through a little bit to tell you somewhat of what's my reflexivity. Let me walk you through how I got to these concepts and hope that they will sort of ground them in our discussion. So my reflexive story starts me out at UC Riverside, an idealistic anthropology major who graduates with a bachelor's in anthropology, ends up at Lakeshore Learning Materials down in Long Beach, California. I wanted to work there because they had a R&D department. They were the first company to do people-colored construction papers and dolls with disabilities for educational settings. I was like, visual anthropology, this is perfect, this is what I want. Very quickly was disillusioned when I ended up in accounting, working on a adding machine, basically, all day. So the next stage in my journey, that lasted a few months, I went to the library to check out the Peterson's Guide to Graduate Schools for every single grad school that I had not yet missed the deadline for, because this was early October. For every program that did not have that had missed the deadline for, that had a program in anthropology. Temple was one of them. I applied, sight unseen. I get an acceptance letter. My mom buys me a tourist guide for Philadelphia. I get in my car and I drive across the country, where I'm happily living the life of a grad student at Temple University. I quickly run out of money and have to get a job. I am fortunate enough to be hired at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Medical Ethics by an anthropologist who was doing bioethics. So I sort of stumble into this bioethics world, love it. But what's more impactful and brings us to the point of today is my dissertation fieldwork at the Mutter Museum. Has anyone here been to Philadelphia or heard of the Mutter Museum? Awesome. If you ever make it over to the other coast, you have to go. It's a 19th century museum of pathology and anatomy. It's part of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, and so it's an original teaching collection. Prior to auditoriums like this, prior to medical schools like this, prior to reproducible photographs and textbooks, medicine was learned really through this apprentice model. So the Mutter Museum is the collection of teaching artifacts from the clinician fellows. And what I was interested in were all of the cultural activities, the social activities that were happening in this space. So remember, this is a museum of pathology and anatomy. It's part of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, which is the oldest extant medical society in the United States. At the time, this was mid-90s, it was very homogenous, it was very wealthy. If you were a fellow of the College of Physicians, you were also a member of the Union League. You also had your ponies, at the clubs. And for them, this was their medical history. This was evidence of medical advancement. The idea that somebody could come in, a surrealistic photographer like Joel Peter Witkin, and use the collections to create surrealistic art, for them, art were the portraits, the oil portraits of the clinicians who'd been there before. That was a struggle. The fact that they're on like the weird and wacky museums in the country books. There's a whole museum dedicated to gross medical stuff. Yeah, there are people who get the conjoined twins tattooed on their bodies. There's an exhibit of a giant and a dwarf and somebody who, I don't even know what the medical condition they had, but they were basically their colon, which they have stuffed and dried there, gets mail to the megacolon, care of the Mutter Museum. I saw you last week, you're really cool. So the clinicians that were in charge of this place hated it. In my interviews with them, they would say things like, get these damn pink-haired punk kids out of my museum. And there was a battle over these interpretations. So they canceled the Mutter Museum calendar, which was sold out everywhere from LA to Tokyo. They replaced it with the Art of Medicine catalog. Again, oil paintings and things like that. So what's fascinating me over all of this is the battle over meanings. These are singular objects with distinct meanings. The tourists are seeing something, the artists are seeing something, the clinicians are seeing something, and that's not neutral. It wasn't neutral for the clinicians. And it wasn't neutral for the clinicians is because when we demystify something, when we open it up to alternative interpretations, that's a challenge to power. And that was when I first started to realize the power of interpretations and the extent to which professional organizations of all types work very hard to put arms around their power, hold on to it, and prevent demystification. So the second objective for today is really to highlight the extent to which demystification speaks to power. And I think that this statement is so, to support that statement. John Berger, Ways of Seeing, book from 1972, it's wonderful. He's actually speaking about the fine art world, but the parallels to medicine are incredible. He has these three statements that I think help us see the relationship between interpretations, seeing, and power. His first is the relatively straightforward but so profound. The way we see things is affected by what we know or what we believe. So our reflexive experiences dictate what we see as the truth. Once we have that truth, to look becomes an act of choice. We only see what we choose to look at. And then the reinforcing cyclical nature of this process is expressed in the third sentence here. We never look at just one thing. We are always looking at the relationship between other things, other people, and ourselves. So how we see things, therefore, implicates power because interpretations are embodied. Because seeing is a physical and a formative act. Your gaze hits the side of my face. I love this Barbara Kruger piece of art. Seeing, the act of seeing, of choosing to look, is powerful. It can be coercive. It can be stigmatizing. It can be all of these things because seeing is integral to our embodiment. which is integral to our reflexive views of the world. So embodiment is, I think, one of the most important and underutilized concepts in medicine. And to show you that it's not just anthropologists looking in at medicine and telling you that there is something valuable to this, this is Carrie Costanza and Abraham Verghese, both clinicians, in their piece from a few years ago, The Physical Exam as a Ritual, Social Sciences, and Embodiment in the Context of the Physical Exam. Their explanation is beautiful. The anthropological notion of embodiment rejects the mind-body binary and instead suggests that bodies and what people think about their bodies is contingent upon history, culture, and a politics of power. Within this framework, each person's body is situated not only within the story of that individual's life, but also in the larger narrative about how social and political structures have created obstacles or opportunities for different types of bodies in the world. The notion of embodiment, therefore, allows one to look holistically at humans in their wider social and political context in which each life is lived. Embodiment brings me to my third objective for this talk, is to highlight, I'm going to say fact, maybe with a lowercase f, the fact that all experience and knowledge is embodied and relational. So what does this mean for medicine? And I will admit, I hadn't necessarily thought about what it meant for medicine until I came to Temple University. One of the first things that I noticed when I arrived in Philadelphia, after driving from Orange County, was the extent to which there is inequity everywhere. And was it in Southern California? Of course it was in Orange County. Did I see it in Orange County? I did not see it in Orange County. I saw it in Philadelphia. And thinking about the health impacts of this kind of inequity and what an embodiment perspective could bring to that. The next couple slides, I'm using Philadelphia as an example, and I'm just going to ask you to think about LA and sort of what you know about LA. Well, how many of you here actually did the same thing I did, but backwards? Are you guys first, second, and third years? All the above? Like, how many of you came to Los Angeles for med school from somewhere completely different? So a couple of you, yeah. So remember when you first arrived, maybe some of those things that struck you. So Philadelphia is pretty bad. We have the second largest life expectancy discrepancy of any major city in the United States. We used to be number one. We got pushed to number two by New Orleans post-Katrina. There's a 20-year life expectancy difference between where my office is, where the arrow goes in North Philly, to where the Liberty Bell is. It's 4 miles, and there's a 20-year on average life expectancy difference. We have inequities in education. This is our 6-year dropout rate. The red is 41 to 50%, right there, right where our School of Medicine is. We work with 2 K-8 schools that touch our campus's border. Of the 250 schools in Pennsylvania, they are ranked 248 and 249. This is an intersection of income and homicides. Red, lower income, little dots, shootings and homicides. This is just one example of many I could have pulled out. You look at sort of our city's state of the health report, and they all look like this. It's worse, right smack there in the middle, right in North Philly. This is just one example of child obesity prevalence. So thinking about different ways of seeing things and the importance of embodiment and the importance of the social forces on bodies led me then to start thinking about what I'm going to call social construction. So you all have different threads in curriculum around social determinants of health, or structural determinants of health, or structural competency, these kinds of things. I think what's interesting is we often talk about them, but we don't often give a sort of theory or a model for how those forces influence behavior or influence health. So this is a model sort of looking at time. We can put this in the United States. What's happening at the top are the social, the beliefs, the attitudes, the behaviors, the things that make us move through the world and have the opinions we do and have the interactions that we do. It's what happens on the surface. What is equally important is the structural foundations that are influencing what is happening on the surface. It could be the laws, it could be our policies that provide that groundwork. So for example, the slide I showed about disparities in education. Socially, we look at underperforming schools. We look at high dropout rates. We look at police presence in schools. But we're likely not seeing the true picture if we fail to look at the structural roots. So how are public schools in the United States funded? Property taxes, exactly. But the average house value, we saw that in the other chart with the median sort of income and house values, are so much less. So it makes sense that those schools are less funded and more students lower performing. And I say makes sense, not because I'm saying that's the way it should be. I'm just saying that there is a reason for it. Poverty and violence, you've got the sort of lack of opportunities, the disinvestment, redlining of certain neighborhoods happened in LA just like it happened in Philly, that have had years of disinvestment in opportunities, which has a correlation to violence. Obesity, for example, sort of the presence of food apartheid, places that have access to food and places that don't. Again, so often we just look at the social realm. I have heard clinicians say this. I explained to my patient over and over again why they have to eat healthier. Like, well, an apple is going to be $1, or a complete meal at McDonald's is going to be $1. Of course, it makes sense that a family is going to eat the less nutritious food, which has a correlation to obesity. But when we bring this approach to medicine, and I saw all your heads nodding, you get this. The social and the structural relate to each other. But when we bring it to medicine, we somehow seem to forget some of that. This is Robert Wood Johnson outlined a model for the contributing factors to anyone's overall morbidity and mortality. I've seen some heads nod. You guys have seen this. What's interesting is that if you sort of adding them up, they'll say 10% physical environment, 20% clinical care, which I don't know, it really pisses off my medical students because they, it's like 20%, that's it. Health behaviors, which are framed as individual here, are they not? Do you smoke? Do you practice safe sex? Do you use substances? And then we got 40%, what we typically put in the SDH, social determinants of health bucket. I think that if we had in medicine a larger embrace of, a better understanding of social construction, the ways in which the structural influences determines the social, and vice versa, the way that the social movements can influence structural change, that reflects and refracts, I think we'd see something more like this. We would see 100% social determinants. Because even physical environment, sure, but it's almost like in your undergrad English classes, never write in the passive voice. There is a toxic environment. No, people have to live in certain toxic environments because that's the only place they can afford. Environments become toxic because the folks who live in those neighborhoods don't have enough political power to fight against them, for example. So proximity to dangerous factories, landlords who won't abate pests. Cockroaches in a house are one of the biggest contributing factors to childhood asthma, which is prevalent in urban cities. Health behaviors, again, access to healthy foods, recreation, safe streets, the things that we're increasingly, thank goodness, more familiar with. But even clinical care is socially determined, in the sense that your curriculum is probably talking about bias, unconscious and otherwise. Your medical education is probably talking about biomedicine's historic, moments of biomedicine's historic untrustworthiness. But there's also things like thinking about just the fact of provider consistency between somebody who has a pediatrician that they've gone to since they were this big to someone who's relying on federally qualified health centers or community clinics. It is not that those clinicians are not good clinicians, but there is a structural component that influences the quality of care. Okay, so it's all social and structurally determined. I'd say it's 100% socially and structurally determined. But there's still something missing if we want to do all we can toward health equity, eliminating or mitigating disparities kinds of thing. And I think we also need to tie embodiment back into this and say embodiment is not just an abstract theoretical concept that is good to think with. It's really fun to think with, but it's more than that. It's lived, it's visceral, and it's felt. These are the opening lines. She's citing Ta-Nehisi Coates at the very beginning of her wonderful piece, Kelsey Blackwell, Race in the Body, Why Somatic Practices Are Essential for Racial Justice. All our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, even social structural determinants of health, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience. It dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. If this is true, if embodiment is this powerful, if there is something to be gained from thinking with this lens in clinical encounters, we also need to adapt not only our clinical practice and our clinical sort of reasoning skills, we need to adapt our ethics. And our ethics aren't really prepared for this. This is anthropologist, psychiatrist, and bioethicist Arthur Kleinman. He writes, ethics, once framed as models of moral reasoning, championing the reflection and rational choice of autonomous individuals in quest of objective standards, those guys on the right with the things on the poles, risks irrelevance to the almost always uncertain circumstances and highly contextualized conditions of human experience. So if life is never not about bodies, our bioethics has to come to learn to recognize this. But does it? Our Pantheon, Bioethics 101, I have stood in our auditorium that looks very similar to this one and talked about the main principles of bioethics. That the professional code of ethics requires us to respect patient autonomy, to practice with beneficence, to work towards non-maleficence, and to use justice as a framework. But what happens when we shine that light to the left side of the cave? What happens when we shine that light into urban spaces? And I will say, urban has a lot of connotations to it, so let me be explicit. The urban, as the adjective in our center's name, and the urban that I'm talking about when I'm talking about urban bioethics, is a shorthand to refer to spaces that are dense, diverse, and laden with disparities. There's something that happens when we shine a light into those spaces where we realize that our ethics is necessary, but woefully insufficient. So for example, if I'm in a space of diversity density and laden with disparities, sure, I'm going to respect your autonomy as a clinician, of course, but autonomy is an abstract right. We've all got it. Okay, you will have a duty to respect your patient's autonomy. If somebody has a right to something, someone else has a duty to it. But what does that actually mean in the contextual hows and whys for a patient who is making those tough decisions between affording a prescription or finding time to exercise or whatever it is that we are asking them to do? So what we need is another concept. We need another principle, not just autonomy, but agency. What is our patient's range of choices that their particular embodiment and their particular reflexivity, because of their particular space in the social construction of the current United States, what are the range of options that that person even sees? We all have different agency, every single one of us. But not just what options are they able to conceive of, but what options are they best able to take? What choices are they able to make? And when we think about something like agency then, it calls into question some of our clinical preconceptions, right? That there is a perfect standard of care. And that if we deviate from that standard of care, that's maleficence. Like beneficence says that we should follow, the standard of care. But if standard of care doesn't work for a particular patient, and we just respect their autonomy by presenting it as the standard of care and they say yes to accept it, it's not actually respecting their autonomy. My favorite example was when a student called me after a rotation. I have to say this at my institution, really. It was not at my institution. It was at another local institution. And they were doing a cardiology rotation, and the cardiologist was looking at this patient who was itinerantly homeless, had blood pressure issues. And there were two choices they could use. They could use the medicine A, it was the gold standard, which would dramatically lower blood pressure, but had no room for give. So you had to take it with food and water consistently every day. And if you didn't, boomerang effect. Medicine B didn't lower it as much, but allowed for a lot more flexibility. And so she's, whatever year medical student she was, third or fourth, in the urban bioethics program, earning her master's in bioethics, and the clinician's like, so I think, based on your blood pressure, we're gonna go with medicine A. And she's like, in the sort of somewhat powerless position of a med student. And afterwards, after the patient left, he says, I'm just really interested. Can you help me understand, why did you choose to push that med, given the fact that our patient is experiencing homelessness? And the clinician said, it's not my problem that my patient can't get their housing in effect. I'm not going to compromise my clinical responsibility based on my patient. So this idea that that's a compromise, this is where the bastardization comes in. I want to eliminate the idea that there are these value judgments and that we need to be focused on our patient. Sorry, that was a long-winded example. All right, pulling this together. So if I'm saying that our bioethics toolbox of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice is necessary but not sufficient, what do I mean? So agency is a principle we have to add. No more of this 4 principles. I want there to be 7. And the other one is agency, which we just talked about. Another is social justice. Social justice is distinct from justice because historically in bioethics and in medicine, justice is procedural. Again, it's abstract. Think about ventilator allocation policies when hospitals were being overrun by COVID patients. How did they determine the scoring for which patient was going to get that ventilator? It was your SOFA score and your sort of odds, the probability that you were going to walk out of the hospital, likelihood of successful discharge. Okay, you apply that to everyone equally who walks in the door. Some could say that is just, but if you're realizing that if your patient is from 19140, which is where my office is in North Philadelphia, has a 20-year less life expectancy difference with multiple, on average, comorbidities, that patient from baseline has less of a chance of being discharged. So we have to rethink our allocation policies, and that's what social justice asks us to do. There's this wonderful bioethicist. Her name is Necka Setterstrom. She's a pediatric bioethicist, and she wrote, you can look it up in the American Journal of Bioethics blog. It's called The Give Back. She was the first person to actively argue and basically say, you can do your SOFA points, you can give these patients points, but if they come from a disadvantaged zip code, or if they are black and brown, have been historically discriminated against, they get a point. That's the give back as a means to, as sort of a form of social justice. I have never seen more bioethics controversy as I have with that. And finally, solidarity is the seventh principle that I think deserves to be in our toolbox. And solidarity, I think, refers to two different things. Not just this, I am here and we're in this interaction together, but also we are in the same system. So those same social forces, the same structural forces that are influencing me in a particular way, that are influencing you in a particular way. Some of us may be fortunate and have certain forces be positive for us. Others of us may be, in certain other circumstances, have the negative forces working on us. But the forces are the same. We are embedded in this same system. And that is an entree to recognizing that there may be racism implicated in this interaction. There may be things that I need to ask about that I don't know about. So if we can make 7 bioethics principles, move away from the Georgetown mantra, and think about principles as being embodied, not just abstract, rational principles, that is a huge step. But the second thing we need in our toolbox is not just the principles, but we need theories. And I use this trolley problem meme because maybe in your Bioethics 101 class in med school, they presented you with the trolley problem, right? Pull the lever and divert the trolley so it runs over one person and you save 5 people. If you do that, you're a consequentialist. If you don't pull the lever, because pulling the lever would break your duty to do no harm, and you run over the 5 people, then you're probably thinking like a deontologist. That's usually sort of where we sort of stop. And it's it's valuable. But this is just a messy meme. And Philadelphia is perfect because we have lots of trolleys, actually. And some trolleys work on push buttons, some work on levers. Lots of them have broken push buttons. So this idea that we need to think not just about deontology and consequentialism, but let's bring in a different North Star for our ethics. And there's a theory out called the capability theory or the capacity theory, which says that the most ethical action is the one that most fosters either the individual or a community's capacity for health. If we follow a deontology or consequentialist perspective, it's a little harder it's not as clean to sort of then argue for patients' agency or social justice or solidarity. But if we're arguing for capability theory to increase everyone's capacity for health, agency, social justice, and solidarity are beautiful. So, with these embodied principles and a more embodied theory, urban bioethics is centering the visceral and the contextual. It centers the actual bodies. And I think by doing so, it is more ethical. So to tie these 5 objectives together, what is this story? That if we start by thinking less about the what and more about the how and the why, which is kind of antithetical to a lot of undergrad med ed, because undergrad med ed wants you to find the what. That's partly what you're here for. There's a huge foundational learning here. But so think about the how and the why as like moving from anatomy to physiology. What is the movement? What is the process? What is the how and the why? Second objective was to talk about how when there's different interpretations of things, it speaks to power. And that is so because all experience and knowledge is embodied and relational. With that, we're led to objective / conclusion number 4, that life is never not about bodies, and we need a bioethics that recognizes this. And urban bioethics helps us do this by being visceral and contextual. So as I'm sort of wrapping this up, thinking, and this was the this was what was on the flyer, I believe, and in the emails that went out. My objective for the day, now I'm telling you this at the end of the story, is to shine that light into those spaces of density, diversity, and disparity, to see what's in the shadows, to realize that we need new tools. We need to not just reflect, but refract back to the field of bioethics, back to medicine. Keeping in mind the bodies of all the stakeholders. You, the ethicist, the hospital administrator, the dean of your medical school, all of these bodies are in this story. So using Plato's cave as a visual analogy, exploring how if we revise bioethics and we focus on the embodied principles of agency, social justice, and solidarity, we can enliven bioethics and medicine in healthcare settings, while centering attention on your embodied and reflective experiences, as well as all the other stakeholders in the cave. Thank you. I think I hit the time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for that phenomenal talk. And I would love to open it up to questions from the audience. If you will raise your hand, I'll rush the mic over.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. The stuff that you were talking about in the last few minutes made me think about this recent controversy that's been going on with some of the new treatments for COVID that are being administered in the hospitals. And there was some pretty explosive papers that came out that claimed that hospitals were giving preferential treatment with these, or giving these treatments preferentially to minorities because the way that they scored actually included race as one of their scoring factors. And so that led to the spicy headlines that like, oh, white people aren't getting these drugs. So I was wondering if you could speak on that and how to sort of counter that narrative. And at the same time, how much, in your personal opinion, based on what you've seen, should we be weighing those inherent systemic oppressions of minorities, Black and brown people, compared to something like socioeconomic status, which also affects white people?
Oh my God, the intersection, yes. It's sort of isms and obias, right? So that has been fun, intellectually, academically fun to watch this debate happen. And I think this speaks to sort of organizational ethics and the power that institutions have to take to make these decisions. Because these should not be decisions for the clinicians at the bedside. Should not be ICU docs' decisions to make of who gets what. It's a different style of ethics. So if we think about sort of the ethics triangle, you've got patients and their surrogates up here, autonomy, agency. You guys are down here, healthcare providers with beneficence, non-maleficence. Institutions are in this other corner, sort of allocation of resources, insurance, that kind of thing. There are conflicts at all of those intersections. But clinicians, if you're talking about a patient, you can't bring in the conflict between clinicians and society. That is, like, beware the triangle, right? Because it's a partnership, relationship between you and the patient. So I almost think we need to help strengthen our institutions to make these sorts of arguments. Because I do think it is just and fair. We need to start doing this. If we are honest and truthful in our effort, in our stated desires to mitigate health disparities, these are going to be hard steps because they haven't been taken before. But I think that's where your generation and the rising voices of, come on, guys, walk the talk, people. And I think urban bioethics can help us do that. And I love your shirt, by the way.
There was a question in the chat, right?
Yes, there was bias in medical records, and maybe it's referring to like OpenNote now, which is fascinating. Do you guys have OpenNote? It's, what's it say?
So first question, I was wondering if you had and I thought it was interesting that the clinician you described was on it.
I wonder if the bias in reporting, Dr. Darrington, if you wanted to also talk about this, because it was a little bit in the conversation that I got to observe this morning.
Yeah, the question was about bias for mandated reporters of abuse or neglect, and that's certainly something that comes up in the pediatric space, but I think also in adult medicine if we're thinking about elder abuse and neglect. So that awareness of the potential for a skewed perspective and the way that we may be interpreting a story differently based on our own understanding of what is going on that might not be the complete picture is a part of that. But there are situations where abuse or neglect is really clear. And then there still is this second step of trying to understand our duties as mandated reporters in the context of the structural forces that go into play once that report is made. And I think one of the things that a lot of us struggle with immensely is that we don't have as much control of what happens after we make that report. And that's not to say that we shouldn't report. It's really about the way in which we make that report and how do we make that report to ensure that we're following the law, but also doing whatever we can to keep our patients safe while also bringing supports into place for the family members and the other individuals and stakeholders involved.
I know we're out of time. I have a 30-second clinical example to support that. And it's not my example. It was my director. She's a pediatrician. She was her resident saw this patient. It was a grandfather brought in his grandson, really high fever. They needed to do blood tests, something else, and a lumbar puncture. And the grandpa said yes to the blood test and the something else and said hell no to the lumbar puncture. And the resident was like, but you have to. This could be really bad. I have to do this. And it just escalated. It got worse and worse and worse. They called my boss, and she walks in and asks the question, why, what is it about the lumbar puncture what's leading you to say no? How did you come to that decision? And he said, I don't trust that you're going to be taking something out of my grandson. I think you might be putting something in. And because the resident wanted to call child services. And she said, Grandpa, how about if we scrub you in, get you all, and you come in and you can watch and I'll walk you through as I do it. And he said, yeah, I'd like that. And they got the lumbar puncture. So part of it is like not just sort of bias in mandated reporting, it's bias in how we sort of foresee that conclusion before we've explored the embodied options to it. Okay, thank you. I love that example.
It's a really great example.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much for your participation and engagement today. Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you.